I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John
or Dean
or Harry, let's do that big job right. Just get in step with the guy that's hep, get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Born and raised in Texas, Dwight D. Eisenhower, also known as Ike, was the 34th President of the United States of America. He came from a poor family who worked in a creamery, and from there was introduced to hard work as a child. He also developed a strong religious tradition. During World War II, he gained much military experience as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Western Europe and of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Eisenhower was also appointed by George Marshall to lead the Army's War Plans Division, was named head of the operations of the War Department, and headed Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. After 37 years of military service, he retired and decided to seek the Republican presidential nomination, with Richard Nixon as his running mate. He called for an honest government and promised to travel to Korea to possibly end the Korean War. On November 4, 1952, Eisenhower was elected the 34th President of the United States. President Eisenhower's domestic affairs program was called Modern Republicanism, for he favored a moderate course that would preserve individual freedom while still ensuring necessary government assistance. His program called for reduced taxes, balanced budgets, a decrease in government control over the economy, and the return of certain federal responsibilities to the states. He ended controls over rents, wages, and prices in 1954. Eisenhower also expanded Social Security by adding almost 10 million more Americans to the program and increasing payments to retired workers by $60 a year. Other accomplishments at home included raising minimum wage to $1 per hour, supporting the construction of the interstate highway system, and creating the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which aimed to protect the health of all Americans and provide essential human services. One of the largest challenges President Eisenhower faced at home was Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy had gained significant nationwide attention due to his charges that communists and communist sympathizers held high positions in the federal government. He even suggested that some of President Eisenhower's nominees for high ambassador positions were disloyal, such as former Secretary of State George Marshall. While Eisenhower was also concerned about communist agents and spies, he disliked McCarthy's harsh methods and his tendency to claim someone guilty until they were proven innocent. However, he feared that criticizing McCarthy publicly would simply degrade his position in office and reward McCarthy with more publicity. When McCarthy began to target the U.S. Army, Eisenhower was outraged, so he decided to order his staff to present information that would discredit McCarthy, using television to his advantage. This helped cast doubt upon all of McCarthy's accusations of communism influence in the Army. Eisenhower then persuaded Republican senators to censure McCarthy, and in 1954 the U.S. Senate condemned him for reckless charges. On May 17, 1954, in the case of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, the U.S. Supreme Court declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. Eisenhower did not speak out in favor of the court's ruling, for he did not like dealing with racial issues. As a result, this encouraged resistance to the court's decision in the form of both political action and violence. For example, in 1957, Governor Orville Faubus used the National Guard to prevent the entry of 9 African-American students into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. After discussion with Eisenhower, and after a violent mob surrounded the school, President Eisenhower sent 1,000 federal troops to enforce the law and to halt Orville's attempt. This action was significant as it was the first time that any president had sent federal troops to the South to uphold federal law since the Reconstruction. Another achievement of Eisenhower's was the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960, which provided federal protection for African American voters. Eisenhower also used his constitutional powers to boost desegregation and appointed federal judges to advance civil rights. Despite this, President Eisenhower was a limited supporter of civil rights and felt sympathetic towards white Southerners who complained about this change in their way of life. In June 1958, he met with prominent African American leaders. However, he became irritated when he heard appeals for more aggressive federal action to advance civil rights. He also failed to follow Martin Luther King Jr.'s advice to use the bully pulpit of the presidency to build support for racial integration. As promised during the presidential election of 1952, President Eisenhower traveled to Korea in an effort to end the Korean War, which was ongoing at the time. During his trip, he spoke with the troops and studied the enemy's fortifications. There was no clear solution. However, he soon became convinced that only strong action would break the stalemate and end the war. So in the spring of 1953, after peace talks failed, U.S. officials hinted to the Chinese government that Eisenhower might introduce nuclear weapons into the conflict, or even extend the war into China. Soviet leaders who came into power after the death of Joseph Stalin also worried about the expansion of this conflict and pushed to end the war. As a result, on July 27, 1953, South and North Korea signed a ceasefire, which is still in effect today. Eisenhower later created the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, a defense alliance against communist aggression. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, died. As a result, Nikita Khrushchev soon took his place. A year before this, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and Eisenhower introduced the policy of massive retaliation, which stated that the U.S. would respond to communist threats to its allies by threatening to use overwhelming force, as well as the approach of brinkmanship. In 1955, Eisenhower agreed to meet Western and Soviet leaders, including Khrushchev, at a conference in Geneva, Switzerland. Although the conference, known as Spirit of Geneva, produced few significant results such as on arms control, it eased tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It was also a small step towards peaceful coexistence of the two superpowers. Soon after this, Eisenhower proposed to Khrushchev the Open Skies program, which allowed both the U.S. and the Soviet Union to use air surveillance to gather information about each other's military capacities. However, it was rejected. In September 1959, in another effort to improve U.S.-Soviet relations, Khrushchev was invited to and visited the United States. This visit led to optimism known as the Spirit of Camp David. They even agreed to meet again in Paris in May 1960. However, when the U-2 spy plane was shot down while conducting espionage over Soviet territory, and Khrushchev captured both the intact wreckage of the plane as well as its pilot, Eisenhower was forced to admit that it was indeed a U.S. spy plane. Khrushchev demanded an apology at Paris meeting, but when Eisenhower refused, Khrushchev walked out. Egypt's nationalist President Jamal Abdel Nasser sought economic aid from the United States to construct a dam on the Nile River in Aswan. Eisenhower's administration, along with Britain, proposed to fund the project. However, when Jamal recognized the People's Republic of China and started talking with the Soviet Union, the U.S. withdrew their offer. In retaliation, Jamal nationalized the Suez Canal by placing it under government control. The canal connected the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. It was initially managed by a British-French company and was protected by British forces. The Suez Canal was a key waterway, for it was a lifeline to British colonies in Asia. The nationalization of the canal also threatened the flow of oil from the Middle East to Europe. As a result, the U.S.'s allies, Britain and France, as well as Israel, who had suffered from raids and was denied the ability to recognize the right of their nation to exist by Egypt, all decided to take military action without informing Eisenhower. This conflict was known as the Suez Crisis. When Israel launched their first attack into the Sinai Peninsula on October 29, 1956, President Eisenhower found out about the ongoing military action and was outraged, for he believed that the attacks would simply strengthen Nasser. He criticized the attacks as well as the three nations, and even refused to supply them with U.S. oil. In addition to this, Eisenhower used his economic power to force Britain, France, and Israel to remove their troops from Egypt. Soon after this, Eisenhower announced a new program known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, which promised that the U.S. would use force to help any Middle Eastern nation threatened by communism. President Dwight Eisenhower helped lead the United States into a time of strong economic growth and national security, such as through the expansion of Social Security and the construction of the Interstate Commerce Commission. He also helped expose Senator McCarthy's harsh bullying tactics, ending one of the biggest challenges he faced at home. Although a limited supporter, Eisenhower advanced civil rights of African Americans through the Civil Rights Act of 1954, which protected their voting rights. Eisenhower also dealt with many foreign issues, such as the Korean War, which he ended only 6 months after he took office. Unfortunately, he did not obtain the peaceful relations he aimed for with the Soviet Union, but he was able to put his foot down and end the Swiss conflict. Eisenhower left in the middle of his second term, but would always be remembered for the legacy of his domestic and foreign policies and as a popular president.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington.